Hi students, this is our first video on the topic of moral responsibility. This issue of moral responsibility is sort of lying in the background of these discussions about punishment, but it's sort of going to come to the fore in this week's videos. What we're talking about when we talk about moral responsibility is this question of who is to blame or to be praised, or who's sort of responsible, right? I guess there's no other way to put it, for the sort of particular action or some state of affairs that took place. And it seems like responsibility is going to be crucial to our intuitions about punishment. So if we don't think someone was responsible for something, we don't think we should punish them for that thing. And so when people are or are not responsible is kind of an important topic that's going to be critical to sort of figuring out when we should and shouldn't punish someone. Now, we're going to look at responsibility from sort of like a couple different lenses, but this first case we're going to look at is on the insanity defense. And this is a sort of a controversial kind of defense. Some people think that this insanity defense should be a kind of defense that people can use in court. Other people think that the insanity defense isn't the kind of defense that people should be able to use in court. And so we're going to look at a case and sort of just see sort of how the law has kind of played out here, but also sort of question whether or not that's the way that things really should be. So the case we're going to look at in this video is State versus Cameron, and this is a case from the early 80s. Now, we've got a little picture here. I couldn't find a picture of Gary Cameron or anyone involved in this case, but it's a case where Gary Cameron ends up stabbing his stepmother a bunch of times. And so let's take a look. So on June 9th of 1980, Gary Cameron stabbed his stepmother Marie Cameron over 70 times, which, unsurprisingly, killed her. Gary admitted to having committed the crime, and he also admitted to knowing that what he did was illegal. So he knew when he was stabbing her that that was against the law. So you might say, well, how is he going to defend himself? In his defense, right, Cameron claimed that he was insane at the time that he committed the crime, and that's as evidenced by a couple of facts. So one is that he didn't make any attempt to hide the body. Number two, when he ended up being found, he was wearing his stepmother's clothes, and maybe he wasn't wearing a shoe or something like that. I think that was also in the facts. And then three different psychiatrists all attested to the fact that he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia and seemed to believe that his stepmother was possessed by an evil spirit. So it's important to note that when Cameron says that he was insane at the time that he committed the crime, we're using the word insane here in a legal sense. So I think there's questions around, well, what does it even mean to say that someone is insane? Well, this is kind of a legal term, and generally speaking, it means that the person doesn't really understand the situation that they're in. So they're sort of living in a reality that's different than the way the world actually is, either because they don't really know what's going on at all, or they don't really understand that what they're doing is wrong or illegal in any sense. And so here, right, he sort of says that he knew that what he was doing was illegal, but his perception of reality was warped by the fact that he was insane. And what we're going to see in a second, right, is that he was sort of, right, he thought his stepmother was possessed by an evil spirit, and then he thought God was telling him to kill her. All right, so we get this quote from the opinion. The mental health experts opined that while Cameron understood it was against the law to kill, he believed he was responding to God's directive and thus had an obligation to rid the world of this demon or sorceress or evil spirit. He describes her in all of those different ways. So when this case went to trial, the court instructed the jury to find Cameron guilty unless it found that a disease or defect of the mind rendered him either A, unable to perceive the nature and quality of the acts which he was with which he was charged, that is, he didn't really know what he was doing, or B, he was unable to tell right from wrong with reference to the particular acts with which he was charged. So either he doesn't know what he's doing, or he can't tell right from wrong with reference to what he was doing. So he couldn't tell whether what he was doing was right or wrong. Now, the instruction went on to clarify what it meant by B, and when it did that, it suggested that Cameron ought to be found guilty unless his disease or defect of the mind rendered him unable to tell what was legal from what was illegal. All right, so Cameron, you'll remember, right, admitted that he knew the difference between what was legal and illegal. He also knew what he was doing. He knew he was stabbing his stepmother. But what he's going to argue is that the way that the court interpreted that second condition that says, was the person able to tell right from wrong, that they described it in the wrong sort of way. So to be more specific, he argued that what matters isn't one's ability to tell what's legal from what's illegal, but one's ability to tell what's moral from what's immoral. And so what he's going to argue is that he knew that what he was doing was illegal, but he thought that it was moral, and since he thought it was moral, then he should be excused for his crime. The thought here is that because moral requirements are overriding, that they're in a sense more important to follow than legal requirements. One whose disease or defect of the mind leads him to think that he's obligated to do something, morally obligated to do something illegal, should not be punished for doing that thing. So we imagine a scenario in which, maybe someone is, I'm trying to think, involved in some sort of, some particular action would be illegal. Maybe we think about euthanasia or something like that. It's illegal to assist someone in suicide, but you think it's the morally right thing to do. You might think, well, you should kind of be excused from the crime because you were sort of acting in accordance with what's moral and you thought that was more important. So we can see how what's moral might be overriding when what's moral conflicts with what's legal. And that's what he thought he was in that kind of scenario. Now, in his more lucid moments, right, he might say, oh yeah, that thought that my stepmother was a demon, that was bizarre, right? It's not true, but that's what it really seemed like in the moment. So the central legal question in this case is really about the jury instruction. So was the trial court correct when it suggested that Cameron should be excused only if he was unable to differentiate what was legal from illegal? Or should his inability to differentiate what's moral from immoral also be a kind of excuse that he can appeal to? So that's the kind of question I would pose to you, right? Spend a little bit of time thinking about that on your own. Right? If you've read the case, how does the court rule? Think about that. How would you rule? What are your reasons? Again, it's always important not only to sort of pick a side, but to figure out why you believe that is the right position. So was the trial court correct to suggest that Cameron should be excused only if he was unable to differentiate what was legal from what was illegal? That is, if someone knows that what they're doing is illegal, should they be punished, no matter what, even if they thought it was moral? So how did the Supreme Court of Washington rule? In an opinion that was written by Justice Charles F. Stafford Jr., the Supreme Court of Washington ruled that the trial court's jury instruction was not correct. So basically they said the trial court shouldn't have clarified the sort of definition of insanity in that way, they should have allowed for the possibility that if someone can't differentiate what's moral from what's immoral, then they should be excused as well. So here's basically that. So it ruled that Cameron should also be excused if he couldn't differentiate what was moral from what was immoral. The majority opinion by Stafford says, although a mother who kills her infant child to whom she is devotedly attached, believing that God has spoken to her and decreed the act, so imagine a mother kills her child, believing that God has told her to do it. Although they know that the law and society condemn the act, it would be unrealistic to hold her responsible for the crime, since her free will has been subsumed by her belief in the deific decree. Deific meaning like God, the decree coming from God. Okay, so I've sort of highlighted part of this statement here, the claim that it would be unrealistic to hold the person responsible for the crime. The thought here is that this person is not a bad person, right? It's just that they're sort of, whoever they are is being controlled by this sort of defect of the mind. So the mother who is devoted to her child but has this sort of bizarre belief beyond their control, right, that God wants them to kill their child. That person isn't a bad person. They don't deserve to be punished. Maybe we should put them in a mental institution, right? We should sort of protect society from that person, but they're not a bad person. So that's what we're getting at here. She's not really responsible for the thing that she did. It's this defect of the mind that's responsible. And so punishment, which is sort of inherently or carries with it a kind of criticism or blame, that's not the right sort of thing to give here. So here we have Justice Stafford's argument. Premise 1 says that Cameron genuinely believed that God wanted him to disobey the law, again, through no fault of his own. Right? He wasn't responsible for the fact that he had this sort of bizarre belief. He wasn't reading, crackpot websites or something like that. Rather, he was just doing his thing, and he had this defect of the mind, again, no fault of his own, and that defect led him to believe this thing. Premise 2 says if a person genuinely believes that God wants them to disobey the law, and it's through no fault of their own, then they're not responsible for breaking the law, right? The thought is it's not Cameron who's responsible for the fact that he broke the law. It's this sort of problem with his brain, or problem with his mind, that made him break the law. Conclusion, number 1, Cameron's not responsible for breaking the law. And premise 3 says if a person's not responsible for breaking the law, then their behavior should be excused, right? They shouldn't be punished. So if you're not responsible for something, then you shouldn't be punished for it. This is pretty obvious in like some cases. If me and my brother are at home and my brother breaks a window, and then my parents come home and say like, John, we're punishing you for breaking the window, I say, no, I'm not responsible for breaking the window, right? It was my brother. And so certainly I shouldn't be blamed for it. I shouldn't be punished. It was this other person. And so the thought here is like, it's not really Cameron who's responsible for the fact that he killed his stepmother. It's this defect in his mind that he had no control over. So as you might be suspecting, right, there's a certain view about, the kinds of people we are, that there can be things that are sort of, we have no control over, that are part of us, but that we're not responsible for, like this defect of the mind. Okay, so if premise 3 and conclusion 1 are both true, then it seems like Cameron's behavior should be excused because Cameron wasn't responsible for the fact that he broke the law. All right, so that's the argument made in this case. I think it's an interesting one, but it's challenging, right? Are we just going to let anyone who's insane and has a sort of defect of the mind lead them to do something illegal? Are we going to just allow them are we going to excuse their behavior, allow them to avoid punishment? That's a tricky question. So that's sort of the question I want to leave you with. Should those who are insane at the time of their offense have their behavior excused, even if they knew at the time of that offense that their behavior was illegal? So if someone knows that what they're doing is illegal, is the fact that they ended up doing something else as a result of sort of a mental defect enough to excuse their behavior? All right, think about that, and we'll talk about it in class. Have a good one.